Hi and welcome back to the Spruegate, a miniature painting scale modeling hobby channel where we'll go beyond the Spruegate and get every miniature and model painted. Today we're doing something a little bit different in that I'm going to take you through a scale model build that I recently finished just prior to starting this channel. As such, I don't have a ton of actual footage of the build, but we'll look at the final product and I'll talk you through some of the aspects of the kit itself to see if it's something you might want to dive in on. Previously to this one, I'd never actually worked in 1/35th scale before, but I had all the paints and tools from years and years of miniature painting for games like Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop war games. Before then, it had been purely 1/72 scale aircraft and tanks from Airfix, and their little, very flimsy plastic men which we used for very old wargaming. So, here's the kit. It is the 1/35th scale M41 Walker Bulldog from Tamiya. Now, this is also, on top of that I suppose, was also my first ever Tamiya kit. Now, I've been watching a bunch of different videos online, and Tamiya seemed like a very safe brand as far as quality and ease of use was for getting into this scale, so I picked that brand, and then I went to my local big box kind of hobby crafting store, and lo and behold, this is one of the kits that they had. And that big box store also has a 40% off coupon that you can apply to anything. The model was $17 originally. I think I ended up paying like $11 for this thing. I mean, this was a fraction of the price of some of the box sets of 1/100 scale wargaming miniatures that I paid for, so I was pretty excited for that. And having talked to a lot of people online after completing this build, it turns out this is actually a very old kit in the sense that the tooling was done, I want to say it's like 30, 40 years ago. And how true that is, I'm not entirely sure, but the tooling's very old, and a lot of people, this was one of their first ever kits, and they built this a long, long time ago. So there's a wealth of people out there who you can use as a good reference if you wanted to get into this. The kit comes with decal sets for US in Korea and Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force, and I was kind of on the fence here. And with talking to some people on Twitter, I was pointed towards some third-party ARVN, which is Army of the Republic of Vietnam decals. As soon as I saw the decal sheet, and they had these wonderful, quote-unquote, hand-drawn, hand-painted dragons, I was like, we gotta have dragons on the side of a tank. Plus, you don't see ARVN represented that much in scale modeling anyway, so I thought this would be a really good opportunity to make something a little bit different. And you might notice that something that I do in my builds is I try to find kits which you don't see much representation of, or decals which are like the alternate sets that no one ever builds, so I'm going to be the one to build those, just because I think that some of those are really, really neat. The build itself, I can attest, was very, very easy. The parts went together almost seamlessly. I was surprised a little bit that the lower and upper hull had a massive gap in between, but that was kind of behind the wheels and the tracks, and you can't really see it once everything was built, but that's partly due because this is a tank that can be used, or originally was intended to have like a remote control motor inside of it, so that's something that you just be warned, there's a weird gap and it looks horrible, but once you put the tracks and wheels on, you can't see it, as evidenced by these pictures. This was also my first time using an enamel-based spray can. That's what the olive drab is, and after I used that, I used a satin varnish to give a real sheen, so it looked like it was painted metal rather than just flat matte, which I use in a lot of my miniatures, and I really liked how this turned out. It made it look like it was a painted metal tank. So the effects I really enjoyed with trying out some new materials with this one. The other thing that you'll notice is I added some armor texture and some weld seams. The kit comes with weld seams molded in, but it's basically just a really deep groove with like a minimal amount of texture in it. I didn't feel like it represented well the reference pictures that I'd seen, so I kind of carved those out and then did green stuff and put little weld beads on it. And there's a really good number of tutorials online. Some of mine I was really happy with, some of them were really messy, but that's something that I'd like to improve on in the future. But I think once it was painted, the effect overall is really, really good. And finally, just the build in general, at least the paint scheme, I wanted to do the kind of very classic, red dirt from Cambodia that you see. So there's a lot of detail that went into the research of this. Again, a friend of mine, he looked up, specific often mechanized companies that went in and dates and times so that we could do it historically accurately, and it enabled me to do a lot with the weathering, which was mixing a lot of different tones of browns and oranges and reds to get a nice mix, and I tried to vary those, so there is some subtle changes between the tones as different layers went on, and all of that's done over the top of the Vallejo ground texture paste, which I would highly recommend for basing and for mud effects. It's a really, really nice product. Now, with a lot of, especially older kits, they come with the rubber band tracks, and the rubber band tracks are perfectly serviceable, and in some kits I would even just use them, no big deal. But even from my former days of 172 when I was a kid, the rubber band tracks are an absolute pain to have the paint stay on them. You can get the paint on, no big deal, but because it's a glossy rubber, and especially as you bend them to put them on, the paint is very wont to flake off. So with that in mind, I bought a set of 1/35th scale trumpeter plastic third-party workable tracks, and those were, I'll be honest, an absolute pain to put together. Each track link has the track piece and then the rubber track pad. You have to cut both of those out and glue them together, each of which needs some filing and sanding, and then you put them all on this little jig, and then there's 2 plastic connector pins that go in the track connectors that you then have to insert in, and some of them don't fit very well and they're pretty fragile, so you have to go through that rigmarole, and you have to do that 140 odd times for both sides combined, I suppose. They look really good. I'm really happy with how they turned out. But I had to do a lot of fudging, especially on my first one, where I didn't want to run out of links because a couple broke, and I was just having a hard time with it. You can see here on the back left-hand track, I just kind of ended up sticking a couple on with super glue to the rear wheel, and not even bothering connecting them. It looks awful, and I'm ashamed of it. But frankly, when it's on display, it's in the back, you can't see it, so it's not that big a deal. I'm the only one that knows it's there, frankly, and most people don't see it. This was also a really interesting learning experience for me from a paint standpoint, and I say that because normally, I'm painting small miniatures, the surfaces are small. These surfaces with the big metal plates are huge, comparatively. And it was interesting having all this empty space, and some of it just looked so bare and clean, and there wasn't much interest in the model after I just sprayed the enamel olive drab paint. It was an opportunity to use reference pictures and things to freehand on paint chips, the rust effects on the exhaust covers. I used my rotary tool to drill out a couple of pieces of battle damage, and yes, the armor on these things would thin enough where the bullets wouldn't bounce off, they'd go right through it, but it looks cool, and that's frankly all I cared about in that instance. I wanted to try out some new techniques. But freehanding things to kind of break up some of the large spaces to make it more interesting was something I hadn't really done up until this model, and some of it was very kind of scary to do. You've got this nice paint job, an undercoat, and some nice washes on, and some oil dot filters, and then you can just sit there and just paint on top of those. It was a lot to kind of break that mold in my head, but I'm very glad that I did, and especially having now seen the after effects of that, I'd be much more confident doing that in the future. So if that's something that, you've been nervous about, or you've not done anything like that, just try it. Seriously, just try it, because frankly, you can always just paint the base coat back over it. It was nice seeing that come to fruition, and it took a couple of times. It took those base layer chips, the steel chips, some rust effects, to finally be like, okay, the final product not only looks a little bit realistic, but also is interesting, and is something I would commit to in the future. The other part of this that I thought was something that I really tried something new on was the actual exhaust pipes. Every other model I just kind of paint them grey and call it good. But I had seen a few tutorials about exhaust pipes and how they corrode very differently from other parts of the model. And so I'd used some stippling effects with a number of different colored greys, and then I used a wash over the top of those to kind of unify them. I guess it would be more of a glaze in this instance, just to soften down that color. And it turned out, it was one of those things where I can't believe I'm using paint to represent a texture, and then, in my opinion at least, for it to actually have done that in the end. And that's one of the biggest takeaways from this paint job that I have personally, is that you can use paint to represent texture instead of having to put texture, like some kind of textured paste or grit on it. You can use paint to do that as well in instances where grit wouldn't be good. Another interesting aspect of something I tried out was I used real dirt, and I used a gravel and sand fixer on it, and then I painted over that. Because those details are so small, it was really difficult to paint the dirt, which was like a natural dirt from my garden, turning it into this red-brown. It was hard to do that without messing up the paint job elsewhere. And so you can actually see there's this tiny little grey line in between the painted dirt and what used to be the kit, where the gravel and sand fixer, which is pretty aggressive, had melted through the enamel base coat. Again, you can't see it from a distance, but there's some lessons to learn there. The Scenic Base is just a slab of wood, basically. It was just in like the little wooden painting section of my local big box hobby store. I paid probably $2 for it. I put DAS modeling clay on it and put some track marks into it to hopefully let my model sit into the ground instead of floating above it. You can see I wasn't very successful here, and that's because I had made those imprints with the rubber band tracks before I'd made the decision to put the trumpeter plastic ones on, and they're slightly different shaped and it doesn't sit in, so that's unfortunate, but again, lessons learned. I did more gravel and sand fixer just to put some textures on, and then painted some individual stones to break up the monotony of the red dirt, and all in all, I'm really happy with how this build turned out. I love the aesthetic of the M41. Its history is an interesting one, and it's built off of, you know, what used to be the old Chaffee from World War II. I always loved that tank as a kid, and, you know, being able to have something that's a bit more upgunned from that and the Vietnam setting was something interesting in a diorama that I wanted to make. So all in all, this is a really nice beginner's kit. I would recommend it basically to anyone, especially because it's so cheap. If you've never done 1/35th scale, this is a nice place to start. The tank's generally only one color, so you don't have to worry about doing any fancy paint schemes or camo schemes or anything like that. You can just slap down a couple colors and then start playing around with improving your techniques on weathering or color modulation or ambient occlusions, things like that, using different filters and washes just to try and build your own style and get things going. So there's going to be probably a couple more of these to come, but then subsequent of these kind of kit review style build review videos will probably end up being a bit more in depth, as I'll be able to record the build process and be able to show you a bit more of those things and the paint processes as well. There'll probably be one of a Zvezda 135th BA-10 armored car coming up, and then after that we're going to move on to a T55, which I have been able to record a lot of the build. So you've got that to look forward to in the future. There'll also be many more actual miniature painting videos coming and other scale model builds, so if you like it, feel free to like, subscribe, and share the video. We do also have a Twitter account and an Instagram account if you want to follow for daily updates and things like that. Very grateful for you tuning in, and thanks a lot.